step into the world of ancient Rome. Not the marble temples and victorious legions etched into textbooks, but the shadowy corridors behind those facades, where power whispered louder than love, and every smile hid an unspoken bargain. Marriage, in that forgotten realm, was no union of hearts. It was an empire of strategy, a web of legacy and control, spun by ambitious families whose names still echo through time. In Rome, to wed was not to fall in love. It was to sign away your body and bloodline in the name of influence. And once that pact was sealed, fidelity was not a virtue, it was a limitation. A husband could walk into another's arms with no shame, and often did. Not only was it allowed, it was expected. Infidelity was never a scandal, so long as it stayed within the bounds of class and custom. Roman men lounged in the company of courtesans, women chosen not merely for their beauty but their wit, their social fluency, their role as extensions of their lover's status. These were not illicit affairs hiding in dark corners. They were statements of power, wealth, and taste. Yet even that is only the beginning of Rome's more unsettling truths. Because in those same marble villas and candle-lit forums, another kind of relationship thrived. One that modern eyes might not expect. Romantic and sexual bonds between men were not whispered about in shame, nor hidden behind veils of secrecy. They were lived openly, woven into the fabric of Roman identity, sanctioned by custom and culture alike. There were no accusations, no need for closets, no sense of taboo, because Rome did not see love through the lens we inherited. It wasn't about gender, it was about power. Always power. Who gave, who received, who commanded, who submitted. That was the only line worth drawing. A freeborn Roman citizen, the symbol of masculinity and honor, could enjoy the company of another man, provided he never gave up dominance. The moment he submitted, he surrendered status. That was the shame, not the act, but the position, because in Rome, even desire was political. The body was not a sacred temple. It was a vessel for dominance, a marker of class, a chess piece in a broader game. And in that game, women played roles far more complex than just obedient wives or silent partners. Many knew their husbands' affairs, accepted them, even leveraged them. Some women found agency within the cracks. Mistresses, schemers, or even poets who turned their pain into art and their restraint into influence. But the cruelty of the Roman ideal ran deeper still. Because not all affairs were consensual, not all pleasure was mutual. Enslaved men and women bore the darkest weight of Roman lust. Bodies taken without rights, without voice. To be conquered in battle meant more than death or chains. It meant becoming property, and property had no say in pleasure. This, too, was normalized, codified, legitimized by law. Rome, the so-called cradle of civilization, built its pillars on systemic violation and called it virtue. And while the elites toasted with wine, the violated went unnamed, uncounted, forgotten. Culture went forgotten. Even in death, the Roman obsession with power and performance never faded. Funeral rituals weren't just about mourning, they were performances. Public, dramatic, strategic. The way a person died, the words spoken at their burial, even the placement of their ashes, was crafted to serve family legacy. If a man died in war, he was immortalized. If a woman died in childbirth, she was sainted. But if you died in disgrace, if you challenged norms, your name could be erased, literally. Romans practiced damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. Faces chiseled out of statues, names scrubbed from marble, as if you had never existed. To be forgotten was worse than death. It was social annihilation. And through it all, what endured was the quiet horror beneath the splendor, the sanitized cruelty behind the triumphs. A society that conquered the world, yet could not conquer its hunger for dominance. A culture that celebrated reason, but embraced unreason when it served their pride. They gave us aqueducts, calendars, and roads, but they also gave us blood-soaked arenas, mass executions as entertainment, and emperors whose madness became divine decree. Caligula, who allegedly made his horse a priest. Nero, who burned his city and blamed the innocent. Commodus, who fancied himself a gladiator god. These men ruled not by right, but by fear and spectacle. Their decadence wasn't excess, it was a reflection, a mirror of Rome's truest face. Because when love becomes a transaction, when pleasure becomes politics, and when legacy matters more than life, the line between civilization and savagery begins to blur. And Rome, grand, glorious, brutal Rome, danced on that line with open eyes. Their truths were hidden in plain sight, carved into stone, passed down through letters, mosaics, fragments, and yet we sanitize them. We forget that behind every fresco, every column, every story of triumph, there was someone silenced, someone broken, someone erased. Rome did not fall in a single day. It rotted from within, from pride, from decadence, from the weight of its own illusions. And as we gaze back at that empire, mesmerized by its grandeur, we must also listen to the whispers beneath the marble, the voices it tried to silence, the truths it tried to bury, because sometimes history doesn't echo, it haunts. Beneath the polished armor of the Roman Empire, deeper than the marble steps of the Senate or the golden halls of Caesar's palace, there were rituals, rituals so old, so strange, and so terrifying that even the Romans feared to speak of them aloud. These weren't the proud public ceremonies recorded by scribes or praised by poets. These were private, hidden rites, twilight devotions whispered in caves, forests, and cellars, where blood-sealed oaths and gods were fed not with prayers, but with offerings far darker. The boundary between religion and fear in ancient Rome was thin, almost invisible. They believed in divine order, yes, but they also believed in chaos, in curses, in spirits that watched from shadows, and to protect themselves from these forces, or sometimes to summon them, they turned to rituals most would rather forget. Not all gods were loved. Some were feared, terrible beings like Mania, goddess of the dead, or Pluto, whose name was rarely spoken for fear he might listen. The Lemuria festival, held each May, was meant to exorcise restless spirits from the home. But it was not festive, it was grim. Fathers would rise at midnight, barefoot, spitting black, baked beans onto the floor as they chanted ancient verses meant to drive away the dead. No feasting, no joy, just dread. And darker still were the rites of the Vestal Virgins, Rome's sacred priestesses. Chosen as children, sworn to 30 years of chastity, they guarded the eternal flame that symbolized Rome's life force. But if that flame ever died, it was seen as a sign of cosmic doom, and if a Vestal broke her vow of purity, the punishment was death, not swift, but ritual. She would be buried alive, sealed in a chamber beneath the earth, with only a flickering lamp and a crust of bread. The city that worshipped her would erase her, suffocate her, mourn her in silence. This wasn't justice. It was theater. It was fear masked as faith, because in Rome the appearance of control mattered more than truth. The image of virtue was everything, even if it meant burying a terrified girl beneath the streets that cheered her only days before. But not all rituals stayed within Roman borders. Some were imported, smuggled in from conquered lands, twisted into new forms. The cult of Cymele, brought from Phrygia, worshipped a goddess of fertility and madness. Her priests, called Galli, castrated themselves in ecstatic ceremony, dressed in women's robes, and wandered the streets in wild processions. Bloodletting, self-mutilation, and frenzied dances weren't fringe acts. They were sacred acts. Rome allowed these cults, sometimes even embraced them when it suited their politics, but deep down, the Roman elite viewed them with suspicion, even disgust. To bleed for your god was foreign. To lose yourself in madness was dangerous. Yet still these rites spread, because beneath the empire's polished veneer was an emptiness, a hunger, a craving for something real, something ancient, something that made the gods seem close again. And perhaps no cult captured this terror more than that of Mithras, a mysterious god of light and battle, worshipped only by men, often soldiers, inside underground chambers carved to look like caves. There, in flickering torchlight, they would reenact the slaying of a sacred bull, drenched in symbolism and secrecy. Initiates passed through stages, each more secretive than the last. The rituals of Mithras were never recorded, never spoken of outside the cave. What happened there remains largely unknown, even today. But we know it was serious, sacred, binding, because in a world where death was always near, where legions marched to foreign lands never to return, men needed something unshakable, a brotherhood, a myth that made suffering sacred. But sometimes ritual wasn't about gods at all. Sometimes it was about control, power. Public execution in Rome was often staged as entertainment, bloody theater for the masses. Criminals were torn apart by wild beasts in the arena. Slaves were crucified in the hundreds, and those deemed enemies of the state, they weren't just killed, they were humiliated, their bodies paraded, their names cursed, their families ruined. Death itself wasn't the punishment, it was the beginning of it, and behind each execution lay a message: behave, conform, obey, or become the spectacle. Even medicine, that supposed gift of civilization, was laced with ritual and horror. Roman doctors were part healer, part magician. They believed disease could be caused by spirits, by curses, by imbalances of the humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and to correct these, they turned to remedies we would call madness. Mercury, liquid metal toxic even in small amounts, was used to treat syphilis and skin disease. Lead, abundant and cheap, was used in cosmetics, cookware, and even wine, sweetening it at the cost of the brain. Doctors would bleed their patients to balance the body, cut into their skulls to relieve headaches, insert animal dung into wounds to ward off infection. One famous Roman physician recommended ground-up wolf liver mixed with wine to cure epilepsy, assuming, of course, that the wolf had been killed in a specific ritual while facing east. These were not quacks, these were Rome's finest minds, and behind every cure lay a philosophy that the body could be conquered like a city if only one was bold enough. But sometimes the darkest rituals weren't Roman at all. They came from the lands Rome tried to erase. In Carthage, the enemy city across the sea, whispers told of child sacrifice, babies burned alive to appease gods like Baal Hammon and Tanit. The Romans wrote of it with horror, calling the Carthaginians barbarians. But archaeology suggests the truth may not be so simple. Were these accounts exaggerations, or did Rome need a villain so badly that it twisted the truth? Or worse, did it project its own hidden sins onto others to mask them? Because Rome too killed its young through exposure, abandonment, and ritual purification. If a child was weak, deformed, or simply unwanted, it could be left on the hillside to die. No ceremony, no burial, just silence. And if that child was female, the chances were even worse. Not all lives were considered worth raising. Not all cries were answered. And yet Rome thrived. It built, it ruled, it called itself eternal. But the more we look beneath its temples and scrolls, the more we find a world that pulsed with contradiction. A society that praised logic and practiced superstition, that worshipped order and fed chaos, that wrote the laws of civilization in blood. To the Romans, ritual was not just tradition. It was survival. It was control in a world that always threatened to unravel. Every chant, every sacrifice, every symbolic gesture was a way to hold back the dark. But sometimes, the rituals became darker than the chaos they tried to contain. Deep in the bones of Rome, past the clamor of temples and the thunder of legions, lay a silence too vast to name, a silence filled with the lives that history chose not to remember. While emperors etched their names into marble and generals carved their victories across continents, millions were reduced to shadows. Slaves, the poor, the diseased, the mad. They built the empire brick by brick, bled for its glory and vanished without a trace. And perhaps nowhere was this more haunting than in Rome's relationship with death. Because in this empire of order and pride, death was both feared and ritualized, yet disturbingly casual. A spectacle, a sentence, an afterthought. They buried their dead in catacombs stacked high with bones, some engraved with names, others left anonymous. Dust beside dust, skulls upon skulls. The poor were tossed into mass graves outside the city walls, decaying together in silence, while the wealthy lay beneath ornate sarcophagi etched with gods they could never meet. Death did not unify, it divided even more deeply. The corpse of a nobleman was washed in wine, anointed in oils, paraded in golden robes before being cremated on towering pyres. The ashes were collected in urns, placed lovingly in tombs, watched over by stone angels. But for the enslaved, for the diseased, for the damned, there was no fire, no procession, just the earth, shallow and cold, and sometimes not even that. Because Rome, in all its might, did not only forget the dead, it erased them. Not just through damnatio memoriae, but through silence. The kind of silence that grows like mold in hidden chambers, like rot beneath the marble. The sick, the deformed, the mentally ill. They weren't honored or helped. They were hidden, cast into asylums, chained in basements, exiled to islands where the healthy didn't have to see them. A woman too unruly might be declared insane and locked away by her own husband. A child born different might be killed at birth, discarded under the logic of eugenics long before the word existed. And those who lived? They often lived in terror, because Roman medicine was not mercy, it was experiment. They cut the living to study the dying. Animists denied fresh cadavers, turned to the enslaved and the condemned. Bodies still breathing were opened on stone tables in the name of knowledge. Organs observed as the heart still beat. Pain rationalized, screams ignored, all for the glory of Rome's science. But cruelty was not always so clinical. Sometimes it wore a mask of celebration. Consider the Saturnalia festival, Rome's carnival of chaos, where slaves became masters and masters served their slaves. For 1 week each December, the social order inverted. Men gambled in the streets, women drank openly. Even executions were paused, but beneath the laughter was something darker, a pressure valve, a release of steam to keep the empire from boiling over. Rome knew the poor were angry, the slaves were restless, the oppressed were watching, so they gave them an illusion of power, of freedom, of reversal. And then when the festival ended, the chains returned, the masters reclaimed their seats, and those who dared believe in change found themselves punished for taking the game too seriously. Saturnalia was not generosity, it was control disguised as joy. And nowhere was control more violently expressed than in the Colosseum. To tourists today, it is a ruin, a relic of architectural genius, but once it was a theater of death. 50,000 voices roared for blood as gladiators fought not just for survival, but for spectacle. These men were rarely free. Many were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war. They trained like soldiers, died like sacrifices. If a gladiator fought well, he might win freedom. If he faltered, he died. Not quietly, not privately, but publicly, beneath the eyes of emperors and citizens alike. Some fights were fair, others were executions masquerading as combat. The condemned were thrown to lions, burned alive, crucified before a cheering crowd. And between matches, the arena was filled with reenactments, mythological scenes, staged with real human suffering. In one grotesque display, a criminal playing Icarus was flung from a platform and left to shatter on the ground. Not art, not justice, just theater. Theater soaked in blood. But the Colosseum was more than a place. It was a philosophy, a mirror of Rome's soul. Pain made beautiful, death made thrilling, human suffering packaged as celebration. It taught citizens not to feel horror, but awe. And perhaps that is Rome's darkest legacy. Not the violence itself, but the normalization of it. Because when cruelty becomes routine, when injustice becomes entertainment, a civilization begins to rot from within. Rome didn't fall in a blaze. It fell like a body succumbing to infection, slowly, from the inside out. Corruption crept into every system. The Senate, once sacred, became a puppet theater. Emperors grew madder with each generation. Caligula declared himself a god. Elagabalus married a Vestal virgin, an act so blasphemous it shook even the most decadent elites. And Commodus, mad with delusion, dressed as Hercules and fought in the arena, slaughtering animals with golden arrows while Rome starved. Meanwhile, plagues swept through the empire, diseases they couldn't name or stop. Entire cities fell silent. The Antonine Plague alone killed 5 million people, gutting the military, crippling trade, and tearing holes through families. The sick were abandoned. The temples overflowed with offerings that went unanswered. And still, the rituals continued. As if the gods had merely stepped away, not vanished, but something had changed. The old beliefs began to crack. People turned to new faiths, Eastern cults, foreign saviors. Christianity, once a fringe sect, spread through the catacombs like wildfire. Its promise of resurrection and salvation offered something Rome never could. Hope for the powerless, hope for the damned. And as the empire faltered, as emperors grew weak and borders grew thin, the unthinkable happened. Rome lost control. Barbarian tribes, once mocked, once feared, swept through the weakened empire. The Visigoths sacked the city in 410 AD, a wound Rome never recovered from. The Western Empire would crumble soon after. Its gods, its rituals, its philosophy, all swallowed by time. But its shadows remain. In our laws, our architecture, our language, and our darkness. Because Rome was never just a place. It was an idea that greatness could be built on suffering, that power justified cruelty, that ritual could replace conscience. And that idea, once born, is hard to kill. History remembers the emperors, the generals, the victories, but the truth of Rome lives in the silence between those stories, in the blood beneath the stone, in the cries beneath the cheers, in the rituals we were never meant to see. And if we listen closely, we can still hear it. The whisper of empire, the echo of control, the haunting truth that beneath civilization there is always something darker waiting to rise.